Today's show is sponsored by Spot from NetApp, the cloud automation platform that makes it easy to deliver continuously optimized infrastructure at the lowest possible cost. Spot helps customers get the most out of their cloud investments by automating cloud infrastructure to ensure performance, reduce complexity, and optimize cost. Their machine learning and automation scale to exactly meet application needs using the most efficient mix of instances and pricing models, eliminating the risks of over-provisioning and cloud waste. Best of all, their software works with leading cloud platforms, services, and tools so that you can simplify and automate your cloud infrastructure wherever your workloads and applications run and however you run them. Discover how leading companies, from cloud-native startups to global enterprises, are automating, simplifying, and optimizing their cloud infrastructure with Spot by NetApp. Check them out at spot.io/cloudcast, where you can find more information, quest a demo, or even start a free trial. That's spot.io/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. As we begin to wrap up the month of August, kids are starting to go back to school around the world, or at least in many places. And like in my case, I think it's been more than 500 days. I think it's been 520-ish days since my children went back to physical school. So amazing that not only did it take that long for them to get back to physical school after basically missing a year and a half, but that we're still somehow in the middle of this crazy pandemic. So take care of each other. Please do what you have to do to help flatten the curve 500 and some odd days into this unbelievable pandemic. I'm going to kind of be short and sweet with this week's Cloud News of the Week. There's some interesting stories, but we have a really, really interesting interview this week, and I want to make sure that the overall time of the show doesn't run too long. So I'm not going to take too long here on Cloud News of the Week. Going to hit on a couple of things. The folks from Postman, who are very well known for their API gateways and API clients, took a Series D round of funding, $225 million, at a $5.6 billion valuation. So we are sort of back into another phase of obviously developers being really, really important and APIs being very, very important. So congratulations to the team at Postman. You've heard me mention before Gracely's theorem, which is there are very few new ideas in technology. There's only faster bandwidth and lower price chips to drive the economic model down. And no greater definition of that than Facebook announcing what I'm going to call Second Life 2.0, which is their virtual reality Facebook Horizon Workrooms, a VR metaverse. Obviously, VR has come a long way. We haven't covered it a whole lot on this show because it feels like it's mostly a consumer technology, but I think we're beginning to see more and more business usage for VR, and Facebook kind of following up on everybody being home and doing meetings quite a bit, and the world kind of trying to figure out whether or not we're going to return to work, whether that's something that'll happen in mass or won't happen in mass. And so Facebook launched this new VR thing. They had obviously done a lot of work with Oculus, but it's interesting to sort of see it, especially for those who maybe weren't around for Second Life and some of the other immersive technologies from, it's been 15 years. And in 15 years, a lot of people forget their history, or they weren't a part of the history. So something to take a look at. It'll be interesting. Really, really going to be a steep road to climb for Facebook to get into the enterprise, given some of the other challenges they have in terms of just other challenges they have with people perspective on Facebook, and whether or not enterprises want people giving up their Facebook accounts and sort of overlapping their personal and business lives. Third thing on the list, Gartner, who often releases what they call their Magic Quadrants, also once a year releases their Gartner Hype Cycle for emerging technologies. And so this is interesting. If you've seen the normal Gartner sort of curve that often comes out, you probably heard terms like trough of disillusionment and hype cycle. NFTs are now at the very top of the emerging technologies hype cycle. Lots of stuff that's on the way up is various forms of AI, sort of advancements in AI. So if you're into sort of what could be happening over the next 2 to 10 years, it's worth maybe taking a look. Lots of just dots on a chart, but a lot of times people get excited about this, especially if you're looking for maybe long-term investment or just some fingers in the air, wondering where the world may go technology-wise. And the last thing I've got on my list, there's a gentleman named Matt Stein, and for those of you who have been around the Cloud Foundry community or the Spring Java community for a long time. You know Matt. Matt spent a lot of time at Pivotal, was one of the product managers and one of the sort of lead developer evangelists as well, I believe. I may have his title wrong. But Matt has since moved on. He's working in the financial services industry now, knows his stuff, knows all about building software, shipping software. And he's been doing a really interesting, what he's calling 30 for 30 journey. And he's sort of playing off this 30 for 30 thing that ESPN has done for a long time, sort of 30 stories in 30 days. Matt's writing a really interesting series of blog posts all about the challenges, the trials and tribulations, the successes, the best tips for how to ship software, which is a thing that I know is near and dear to his heart, and really an interesting series. So if you get a chance, take a look at it. It's in the show notes under Cloud News of the Week. And Matt's somebody who has been, not only living with this, but also really, really passionate about it. So for those of you that are in that space, CI and CD and shipping software and wanting to make your business and your development teams more efficient, definitely go take a look at that article, or series of articles that he's written, 30 in 30 days. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Like I said, we have a really, really interesting interesting interview coming up after the break. Kind of an interesting crossover between somebody who has very much lived a lot of interesting technology, built a lot of interesting technology, and is now helping to sort of fund and find the next generation of it, but really has some interesting insights into how do you go about building those teams and finding the right people. So we'll get to that right after the break. Today's show is brought to you by CBT Nuggets. You know how much we value ongoing education on the Cloudcast, and CBT Nuggets is exactly what Aaron and I wish we had when we were trying to get our certification early in our careers. CBT Nuggets is all about bringing a personalized touch to learning about cloud computing, virtualization, networking, DevOps, and much, much more. Whether it's their hands-on labs with personalized coaching or the online chat functions that come up with every instructor-led course, CBT Nuggets' team of experts is always there to help you get the most from your training and your path to certification. You can check it all out at cbtnuggets.com/cloudcast and sign up for a free trial. You get access to the full catalog of great training, including virtual labs, quizzes, and other premium features completely free for the first 7 days. That's cbtnuggets.com/cloudcast. And we're back. And folks, today we're going to do something a little bit different. Obviously, what most people tune into the show for is, they're looking to learn about our industry. They're looking to learn about technology. We're very fortunate to get a lot of really great guests that bless us with their expertise, their experience, and their willingness to share. And today we're not going to talk so much about a given technology or given technology trend, but really something that a lot of growing companies have to deal with, and a lot of things that companies wish they had some experience in, because when you're looking for certain roles, certain really important roles within your organization, you can't make mistakes, or you really want to avoid the things to do to make mistakes as much as possible. And today we're really excited. Jason Warner, who is managing director at Redpoint Ventures and formerly have held some really incredible engineering jobs, is going to join us today. Jason, welcome to the show. Great to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Before we dive into this topic, give us a little bit of your background, kind of some of the places you've been. The companies you've worked with are going to be names that our audience is really familiar with. But give us a little bit of your background, and then ultimately what moved you from being on the product side, kind of cloud side, to moving over to Redpoint.
Sure. Great. So, I'm at Redpoint right now, managing director. That's a venture capital company. Before that, I was CTO at GitHub for 4 years. I joined about 2 years pre-acquisition, and I was responsible for all aspects of product engineering, design, infrastructure, data, security, things like that.
Yeah.
Before that, I was similar role at Heroku, which is a platform as a service, which got acquired by Salesforce. And then before that, similar at Canonical, the people who make Ubuntu Linux. So I was directly responsible for Ubuntu desktop, phone, and server for about 5 years.
Yeah, very, very cool. You've had your hands in something that I would say probably, 50, 60, 70% of our audience probably deals with on a day-to-day basis. So very, very cool. The origin of this show, we were talking about it before we started, was you had just sent out a tweet. You had, you've recently moved over to Redpoint within the last year, within the last few months, and you sent out a sort of nothing tweet that said, "Hey, I'd love to do a podcast where I sort of share my knowledge of what's the thought process people might go through when hiring a VP of engineering." And given that that's such a critical role, especially for companies that are growing, but also companies that are expanding, thought that'd be sort of a fun way, sort of a fun topic for us today. And I'm going to give you lots and lots of leeway to share your knowledge, but let's kind of talk about why is that such an important hire, whether it's for a really early stage company or even a company that's growing, had a great first product and maybe is looking to build a second product. Like, why is that role often talked about with so much reverence that you just have to get it right?
So I think there's a couple of things that all play into that specific role, which are one, most companies when they're founded have some sort of a technical member of the founding team. So let's just call that person CTO here going forward. And that person largely is hands-on coding in the early days, and then mostly hands-on coding at some point, and then less hands-on coding, and then they start to realize that that's not what they do well.
Right.
But by that point, the company is probably itself doing well if they've gotten to that realization. They've raised some money, or they've got a product in market. They've got a decently sized team somewhere, and so that becomes an issue. That person in the technical seat, the CTO seat, might not have the skills or the desire to be the VP of engineering. That's one.
Yep.
The second is, as most companies grow and actually achieve some success, they slow down. And they slow down for a variety of reasons, but a lot of the quick fix for this is hire VP of engineering. And that we can get into that topic too. But then the third, I think, is there's only a couple of positions in the company outside of the founding team that are what I would call high leverage positions. And I don't think any larger in the early formation of a company than VP of engineering. Because if you're going to classically structure the company, the VP of engineering is probably going to have the most headcount in the company up until you are almost probably a public company and you have a sales team that would match the size. But if you think about it from that perspective, nobody has more influence over the company and the day-to-day operations week to week or month to month than the VP of engineering.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree. I think, the number of things that they can influence, whether it's, technology decisions and architecture, the culture of, how fast you build or how you work with product management, or just, do you create a culture that's going to enhance or excite new people to want to come work for you? Yeah, it's as a technology company, if that's what you're building, or even if you're, I guess, everything these days. Yeah, you're right. That role is so in the middle of everything that you have to really get it right. Now, does that? Go ahead.
I was going to say, one other thing there too is that the high leverage positions are high leverage for a reason, but what people tend not to think about with high leverage positions is how they go right, but what happens if they go wrong?
Right.
And in a VP of engineering, or the first product manager or second product manager or head of product, eventually, if things go wrong, they can be devastating for the company, not just incrementally bad, but devastating.
Right. And how do you think about it? I mean, you've been at both, large growth companies, but now your focus is on, helping small companies become large companies. Does the perspective change? Does, the influence level, the leverage level change if we're talking about the first VP of engineering or, the second or third or fourth, right? Somebody who has, a large sphere of influence over a lot of engineering. Do you think about it differently, or does it tend to just be, if we get it right the first time, hopefully we can, get it right the second time?
So it's a very interesting question. I think that the way to answer this one would be age dependent to a degree. So a VP of engineering you're going to hire for a 50-person company will look very different than if you're going to hire the prime engineering leader for a 500 or 1,000-person company, obviously. And each one of those has a different degree of difficulty associated with it. What I tend to think about when you're hiring your very first VP of engineering is it's actually lower stakes, in my opinion, than some others hiring later, though it's setting precedent.
Yeah. And
whenever you're setting precedent, you obviously want to get it correct. But what you should not be optimizing for is when you're a 5,000-person company, is this the person that is also going to be in that same seat? Because the answer to that question is likely no, no matter what, just from a time horizon perspective, skill set perspective, or even desire perspective. What you should be answering is whether or not this person can take us from, let's say, the 10, 20, 50 people to the 100, 200, 500 perspective, or put us on a track to get that. And they themselves, do they show an aptitude and ability and desire to grow and learn along the way themselves?
Yep. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I want to tap into a little bit of your experience. What's, at a high level, what's sort of the process or, the checklist? How do you start from saying, okay, we've reached a point where we think we need to make this hire. It makes business sense. It makes organizational sense. What's sort of the process you then go through to figure out, okay, how do I make a list of candidates? How do I, create a list of criteria that are the most important things to me? Like, what kind of walk me through, how you've thought about that process in the past?
Sure. So the classic answer to this would be write a job description, hire a recruiter.
Yeah.
And yes, those are useful activities, though I don't think that they tell the full story about what you're after. And a practice I've taken to recently, in the past 2 years or so, is what I will do for any job or role that I'm hiring for at a particularly high level is, as corny as this will sound, is I write the 2-year exceeds expectation performance review.
Okay.
And the reason why I do that is because you get pretty specific in there about where you think you need to be in 2 years and what they did for you. So, you're hiring a VP of security, and you write down that, we stopped a bunch of bots from being activated on the platform. We, cut down on the abuse vectors. We completely defended against, 2 nation state attacks or a DDoS or some sort of SIM exchange hack. You get the idea, but you're starting to write these things down, and they're showing a lot of work activities that would need to get done. You would also put in there, and we grew the team by X amount, and we were able to handle this. And so you really get a handle for what this person or this role will be doing. And that's a very good conversation to have with potential candidates. Job descriptions, to be blunt, are copy pasted from the web. Most people don't write job descriptions from hand anymore. And this is an actual activity that you have to write by hand. And that's the usefulness of it, is that you have to get explicit about it. Yeah. So I find it to be a much more valuable tool than the job descriptions themselves.
Yeah, and it sort of leverages the sort of work backwards mindset, yes. Right? Like write the headline first, if you will. Or
That's exactly right. And the intent there was to find something analogous in that same way. The other side of it for getting going too is, again, in a work backwards sort of way, is to say where the company or the department or the blah is supposed to be in some time horizon. And if you have a strong enough understanding yourself of what that looks like, you can almost picture the candidate profile in your head too. Then you just have to write that down and be really crisp and clear about what the rest of the organization has to align on too. And this is actually where I think most role hiring goes wrong, is the organization is not aligned on what the organization needs. So they might think that they need a VP of engineering that is hyper technical, or they need a VP of engineering that is 100% empathy focused, or any of those sorts of things. And this is not the point in the podcast for me to give my own opinion on those, but I would say if you're not aligned, you're going to have a hard time hiring.
Right. Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. How do you, so like you said, you sort of write the review, you write the headline, you're working backwards. The process moves along, you kind of filter through and you find, I don't know, a half dozen candidates, or, 3 or 4, whatever it boils down to. How do you kind of go through? Because a lot of times, just like people will cut and paste the job, requirements, they'll also, you may look at resumes and you go, boy, these look a lot the same. Like, how do you start evaluating, like, for example, a lot of times if you're interviewing with Google or Amazon or any large size company, they'll kind of go, okay, well, you did this and you did this, or at least this is on your resume. And they'll kind of go, but how much did you do? Right? Versus, okay, your company did that. You were part of that team. How much did you do? Like, how do you sort of sort through did this person do this? Were they really responsible for driving it, versus like, hey, they were part of the team and the team won the championship, but they were the relief pitcher. They were the second baseman. They didn't that type of thing. How do you sort through that?
Yeah. So two things here. One is all resumes are going to look the same, I think, too, which is just the nature of the game these days. So you have to get to this point in the conversation, the interview and the conversation. So you're exactly right. You don't want to. There are plenty of good leaders out there that were part of a rising tide. But what you're actually after, if you're trying to find what I call a trajectory changer or a curve bender, you're trying to find somebody who was responsible for that in one way, shape, or form. They don't need to be ultimately the entire story, but they needed to have been a major portion of that story. And so to get to that, it's obviously going to be part of the conversation. And the questions are all about, talk me through the projects, talk me through the organizational structures or the organizational alignment or any of those things, but walk me through the way in which you view the world, your principles, your practices, the things you're optimizing for. Why was that successful? Why questions are the easiest way to get to the root and answer the one question you do want to answer, which is, was this person responsible or was this person a participant? And, why questions reveal a lot.
Yeah.
And the classic "it depends" answer is usually the start of the answer, but a lot of fakely credentialed people in the industry can say it depends because everyone knows that's the correct answer in most cases.
Right.
It's what comes next, and that's why your job as the interviewer is to ask 2 or 3 follow-up questions and see to what depth they can get to.
Yeah. No, and that makes sense. I mean, to a certain extent, it feels like obviously you've been in roles that have been of significant scale, of significant breadth, and obviously like you're kind of comparing them telling you their why versus you sort of having lived maybe a few years earlier, and you're kind of going, okay, that seems about right. Nope, that's probably BS. Like that doesn't really happen that way. And what about a scenario where you're like, we're trying to hire this person because we need to do something very different. Like, do you reach out to your peer networks and can kind of go like, hey man, I'm in over my head, but I know we need to do this. Like, do you find yourself in that situation, or have you found yourself in that situation where that role is going to help solve that?
Yes. So this would be, let me step off the path for 1 second and then I'll come right back, which would be this, is that if you're good at your job in terms of finding people and talent, you can understand how it would look even in other industries that you're not deeply familiar with. Mm-hmm. You just have to stay away from jargon and you have to stay away from some like deep, dark secrets of the industry. But if I were to be plopped into a professional football team and I were looking for coaches, I would understand to a degree what a quality leader might look like. Now, I don't know if they're good at their function. That's where I would have to rely on some experts. But I can tell you if this person's full of crap, or if they're BSing their way through the interview, or if they're just parroting what somebody else told them, because that's a universally applicable skill.
Right.
And so if you can develop that, you can get through 50% of these conversations. The other 50% of when you need to rely on experts, you need to go and you need to get an education yourself so that you can at least sniff through. And the easiest way for me to do this is to basically analogous things. So let's say I was diving into, artificial intelligence 10 years ago, which is when I started to get into it with others. And I'm not an expert. It was never going to be my area of expertise, but I needed to know just enough to be able to be an executive.
Yep.
So I needed to understand what terms meant in that domain to my domains, distributed systems or things of that nature from a technical perspective. And then once I understood some of that, I was able to go read more on the topic and at least build up these things in my head that were, they don't need to be 100% true. They need to be directionally accurate. Once you have that base set of knowledge, you can get through probably another 20 to 25% of that. Then for the actual deep, dark technical competence, you need to rely on an expert.
Yeah. And
when you're relying on an expert, if you can pull them into the interview, that's fantastic because they're a part of your company. But your job now is to make sure that expert has one thing on their mind. Are they themselves a good judge, and are they a good arbiter of talent or a good judge of technical competence? So they themselves might have the deep technical expertise, but if they can't see it in others, you don't want them in the interview. But if they can, then you've got that match made.
Yeah. No, I like that. It's sort of somewhat of a layered approach, but it's a good way of thinking about, okay, this much I can pull from my own background, this much I've got to do some homework, and this much I've got to sort of reach outside my comfort zone. I like that framework of kind of thinking about it.
And think about it this way: if you're really good, at figuring out people, which is what you're doing when you're interviewing to a degree. You want to figure them out and then figure out what they're saying is true, and then they can be backed up day to day. It's a pretty universally transferable skill. So good example might be that it's very easy to suss out on Twitter these days who the shill accounts are, or who the pomp and circumstance people are, or who the loudmouth braggadocious type of know nothings but have big followings are. They're pretty obvious.
Right.
But if you're 14 or 15 or 16, you don't have that. You've not refined that skill. And that's who a lot of these people kind of prey on to get that audience these days. But if you know it and you see it, it's obvious to a lot of us. It's kind of the same. You're using the same set of skills to filter out that, this tech luminary is actually an idiot and just like complete full of shit. But you get the idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's as if a magician had to do tricks in front of a bunch of other magicians.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why, by the way, that's also why, like in Twitter scenario, you never see them hanging around with industry experts. They've always got a very naive or younger or a less astute audience.
Yep, absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit. We famously hear about engineering interviews and coding interviews and things. I doubt that probably happens a lot at the VP level. But how do you tend to think about it? I mean, we talked about it a little bit. You said, look, there's times when the thing you need is a very technical person. There's other times when you need somebody who's, a little more empathy driven. Like, how do you kind of try and figure those things out? Because, like if I'm VP of engineering, I have to be, attuned to what's going on in the market. I have to be able to communicate with my product manager, whether that's just saying no to requests or whether it's time schedules, but I probably have to talk to customers. Like, how do you suss out finding the right balance for, the need of the job, but also the culture of the company?
Well, I think that the job is always the double-sided, two sides of the coin. So there is the people side and the product side.
Yep.
And because people make the product, and the product needs to be successful so you can employ the people.
Right.
And so you can't divorce those two from each other. And I think that's actually one of the things that we've done poorly in the industry in the past 10 years is we've gone overly oriented towards the people. And I'm just being really blunt here, is that we've lost sight of some of the product execution in the industry. But that's because it's a pendulum swing. And because that means that the previous 10 years before this period, we were way too focused on the product to burn people out. But the point of being a leader is that you actually achieve product success with the people, and you build up the people so they have success in their career, and they're using the product as a springboard. So I famously say that if you're building a culture of an organization and you think culture is ping pong tables, beanbag chairs, and drinks in the fridge, you're missing the point. It's what you do, but it's also how you do it. And they need to be married together, because if you have major financial success, but everyone hates you along the way and is burned out, you're not really doing the job. You might have made a ton of money for yourself or your company, but no one's going to hire you again, and your reputation is going to be garbage. Yeah. But on the other side, if you build the best organization in the world in terms of culture and empathy and people orientation, but you never have success from a product perspective and ultimately a company perspective, people are going to discount you for that lack of success, and they're going to point to the culture.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. And it's like you said, there are, just like there can be people who are sort of fake in their resume and their skills. There's also infinite numbers of ways to sort of, for a few years make something look really great, and under the surface, it's you've hollowed out or just rotted something that really needed to be stable.
That's right.
So in your role, we've talked about, you've been in both smaller companies, growing companies. You're now in a role to help small companies. Like, how do you? Maybe this is an experience question. Maybe this is just a how you think about it question. At some point you go, okay, we're going to hire this role. You assume there's probably some amount of other engineering talent within the organization because you've built up that first product, or it's the fifth product. How do you think about the decision of, like, should we be hiring internally? Because obviously they know our company, they sort of know what we've done, versus, okay, we should consider external, or do you not even sort of start with that mindset? You're like, I'm going to find the best person, or how do you sort of think about navigating when it makes sense to hire internally or externally? Because obviously, they both have their pros and cons as to, what it will do for the next steps of the company.
Yeah, I default to trying to hire internally first. Okay. I think that it's usually a less wasteful, maybe it's not the word, but there's less hiring internally, and it's promoting internally. You get it wrong, internal hire, there's going to be a lot more broken glass. So you're going to want to look for people internally first. And one of the things I do recommend is you don't actually call it VP of engineering for quite some time too. You call it head of or lead or any one number of those things before you get to VP of engineering. And if you're going internally, you can get away with that for a long time. Yeah, because it just makes sense. If you're a team of 10 people, you don't need a VP of engineering. You need a lead. And if you're a team of 20 people, you probably need 2 leads, not a VP of engineering still. What you actually need is a way to organize the days, the weeks, and the months, and to communicate status up and down and those things. The title is not going to bestow anyone any number of those abilities. Right. So if you're growing organically, it's probably better to think about it that way. The times to go external are obviously when the organization is tapped out, or the role has gotten big enough and it can't be done by one person. Okay. You've got 3 people covering it. Yeah. And that's typically where you start to see people really reach for the VPs, which are, somewhere probably around 30, 40, 50 people, or then you go SVP if you've got 2 VPs or something like that. And, that's a couple hundred people. Yeah. Okay. Now, I've been sort of setting this up as sort of this journey, right? Like, why did we do it? What were we looking for? So let's assume we found the ideal candidate. They're ready to go. People internally have bought off with them. Everybody likes them. What are some of the things that you do as their leadership, right? So you're CTO, you're CEO, you're whatever, you're CFO or COO. Like, what are some of the things you're doing to make them successful as they take on this bigger responsibility, or they take on, certain amounts of uncertainty? Because every time you're building something, there's a level of uncertainty. Like, what are some of the things you've found that are helpful to do in that first, 100 days to make them be successful, give them a foundation to be successful? Well, I think going back to that 2-year performance review, exceeds expectation performance review is a really good one, which is remind them what you're looking for a couple of years from now too, and make sure that they understand what it is in a work backwards scenario. If you're building an engineering system and you say, hey, ultimately 5 years from now, it needs to be able to handle these sorts of things. Many people can break that down to the point where they're saying like, well, the next logical step from where we are right now would be to blah, X, Y, or Z. Yeah. And what you're effectively doing is you're piecemealing the components apart in your head mentally, and you're trying to de-risk certain aspects. And you're saying, well, the trickiest part of this is going to be this. So let's focus on that. But the highest priority thing would be this. So we're going to, parallelize those 2 efforts and answer a couple of questions. Gotcha. It's not that dissimilar organizationally. You've got to, if you say that, hey, 5 years from now, we're going to be 500 people and we're only 10 right now. Well, you don't need to go put in the review process for 500 people. But what you need to start thinking about is, okay, so right now we don't have any engineering ladders. We don't have any process. We don't have any role descriptions. So why don't we just say, like, right now we're just going to, on paper, say we're going to have senior eng and junior eng or something like that. Yeah. And you just start, iterating. There's actually a really interesting novel writing technique that I learned about a while back. It's called the snowflake method for novel writing. Okay. And it was by this ex-physicist or a physicist who decided to write some science fiction novels. And the idea is essentially that you don't have the entire story fleshed out, but what you do is you start with a 1-line description of the story. You then evolve that into a 1-paragraph description of the story, and that evolves into a 1-page overview. And then you iterate by doing character names and role. And then you take each character and you take it to a paragraph. And you take each character and you take it to a page. Then you go back to the store and you take that 1-pager and you make it a 5-pager. And you get the idea. You're slowly building these things up.
Yeah.
And visually, what that looks like is you've got a triangle, but then you overlay another triangle on top of it, but just slightly offset. Then another triangle, then another triangle. And then what you realize from a mathematical perspective, we're looking at like fractals all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, that's why it's called a snowflake. You start with a triangle, but you end up with a snowflake at the end, and that's your story. Building organizations is almost the exact same conceptual. You don't do it all at once. You do it slowly over time and in iterations, and you overlay them on top of each other.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I've seen that sort of similar kind of concept when we've done, marketing messages and product rollouts. It's like, okay, what's the 10-word version of this, the 25 version, the 100-word, but it starts you to be very focused of like, what exactly is this thing? And then it sort of focuses you to go, okay, tell me a little more, right? And then as you start to sort of tell yourself a little bit more, or you paint a bigger picture, you're sort of like, okay, does that still convey what we wanted to convey? And that makes a ton of sense. I'm curious, and I don't know if you've run into this. I assume, having been at larger, or successful companies for a while, like not everything is wine and roses, right? You go through periods where you're like, man, this project, this effort, this code base is a mess. Have you ever run into situations where you bring somebody in and maybe you're bringing them in because somebody quit, or, it was the wrong personality, or just you need something? Like, is there a different thing that the leadership team above an engineering needs to do if they're bringing them into a mess? And I mean that in the context of like, normally you might say, well, yes, I give you a 2-year window, but if you come into something that's essentially a rebuilding project, that year 0 or year 1 is oftentimes like, I'm doing a lot of cleaning out versus I'm doing a lot of building. Like, have you seen that before? Do you have any advice for folks that are bringing people into that type of situation? It's a bad situation, but like, you're like, that's our bad situation. It's just got to get fixed.
Yeah, that's a little bit what I became known for. In fact, that's what I walked into at GitHub.
Okay.
And GitHub was a little bit more unique too, because it had an uninvolved founder. The CEO at the time just wasn't involved in the business.
Okay.
So but I was on the same page with all of the other executives. And so this was interesting. GitHub's experience for me being brought in was, we had a head of talent, a head of recruiting, and CFO, and a head of sales who were very involved in the business. Mm-hmm. And they put together a packet for me on all the feedback from their organizations about the product engineering and executive organization at GitHub. And the head of talent and HR, she put it together for me and gave it to me as like my onboarding. And I got it 2 weeks ahead of time. I walked through it. I also had an onboarding buddy who walked me through all the different departments and everything like that. And it was very clear from the outside and inside during the interview process, and plus that with my interviews with all the different organizations. And then when I got involved inside the GitHub, I went and talked to every department and every director in every department. I did a lot of this, and I was able to triangulate themes, and I relayed them back to the organization that I heard them. And everyone was on the same page. So I just said, here's what I plan to do in the first 30, the 60, and then the 90 days. And I reviewed it every week at exec staff with them. And I think it applies. If I were in the same scenario as a CEO and I was bringing somebody who was going to clean up a mess, I would say the thing I care about over this time horizon is this. And I would think that, what I'd like to see is in the 30, 60, 90 kind of approach. This is what I would recommend you do. But I would love to see the answers to the following sets of questions.
Yeah. No, and I think it makes a ton of sense. Obviously, you've got to find some level of sort of shared responsibility because, you walked into something, it was created before you. But I think the other part that you highlight, which is really important, is, that level of, okay, we all got to a common set of words, right? We got to a common set of problems. We all understand it from the same perspective. You're going to be real transparent about frequent communication, and you break it down into small enough chunks such that, you don't get into that problem where people go, $1 billion, that seems like a really big number. How are you ever going to get there? And you're like, well, we're going to get there by getting to 1 and then 2 and then 10 and 100. And that's very, very good advice.
I think it's really important too to have the same expectations, and that's why you have to lay them out. So in that 30, 60, 90 approach, I mentioned to the entire exec staff as well as my staff at GitHub when I joined, I said, hey, I'm going to take a very intentional approach. which is for 30 days, it's the listening tour, replaying back all the notes that I've heard, et cetera, et cetera. 60 will be slowly implementing a couple of different things, making some key decisions if we need to, or undoing or stopping. And then 90 is when we would start to make either wholesale changes that we need to, or some other, larger, more invasive changes. But what happens naturally is people get impatient. Yeah. They forget that you've only been there for 2 weeks. So that's why constant communication is really important.
Yep.
And a more structured, more disciplined, kind of more experienced exec team will understand this, and a less experienced across the board will not. And they want to see change happening faster. That's why you have to be constant communication.
Yeah. And
just understand too that, hey, sometimes it changes on the candidate on the fly too, and you might have to just roll with it.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to ask one last question. I want to be conscious of your time. Let's take the flip side of this. You are, somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, Jason, I'm thinking about interviewing for this VP of engineering job. You know me, you know my background. Like, what advice do you have such that I shine, that my best stuff comes forward, that I don't, waste time with stuff that, doesn't meet what they're looking for? What sort of advice do you give to somebody, whether it's, somebody who's kind of currently in a role and looking to move to a different company, a new thing, or even like, hey, I'm a senior director. I want to prove to them that I'm capable of that, but I don't have the title yet. Any advice you might have for somebody?
So going back to the earlier note about whether or not someone was responsible or party of, almost everybody is going to be a member of or a participant of some degree of success if they're going to have future success in their career.
Right.
So you can never really lay claim to I was responsible for something entirely for an organization, but you can lay claim to I was responsible for something inside of your purview. Mm-hmm. And understand that and what you actually were responsible for, and be able to tell that story well. The lessons you learned, the things you would do differently, things that went right, went wrong, all that sort of stuff. Pull as many lessons as you can from that. I also think that that person should be watching the rest of the organization and other organizations and kind of like understanding what is going well and what's not, and drawing lessons from them so that they can tell observational stories as well. I'd very much recommend people do this, because I think it's a very quick way to get out of I'm not ready mode, which is if you can understand why someone could be or won't be successful from afar, you probably are able to at least be able to navigate the situation that you find yourself in. To sell someone that you're ready is a little bit different. And I think that what you've got to be really blunt about is, hey, I've got a couple of gaps and here's what I plan to do about them. Or, what I would need to be supported by to do that. And are these concerns for you? See if they're deal breakers or not. And then the other is just to put it back on them and ask them, what do you think success looks like here? What do you think goes wrong here? What do you want to see changed in the organization or the department or the division? And if they don't have a clear answer to that, that's also a red flag on another side of the fence, which is they don't actually know what they're looking for either. So put it back and ask that question. And then lastly, I think if you want to really shine in interviews, is engineers and engineering leaders, particularly younger or earlier in the career, tend to be less projective, I think. Like we talked about it depends, and they'll say the it depends answer, but they won't say the it depends and then give an opinion or give a specific example. And I think you have to give specific examples. And then once you give the specific examples, be able to support it with why it was successful or why it went wrong. And if you can't do that, you're not ready for the job. If you can do that, you still might not be ready for the job, but at least you're ready to interview for the job.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. I think we've heard this theme over and over again that as much as it may sometimes get dismissed in engineering circles, like storytelling is important, right? At some point, you're trying to help people change. You're part of change. Being able to do that, being able to synthesize big concepts down into smaller things is super important. And I think you're right. I think you have to be able to sort of look yourself in the mirror and be like, am I ready? You may think you're ready for this, but can you kind of pass some basic tests of being like, yeah, no, I am really ready. I've proven it to myself. I'm ready to go see if the world thinks I'm ready for it. No, that's super good advice. Jason, I want to thank you so much for the time today. This has been great. I know we went in a lot of different directions, but I'm really appreciative of you sharing all your background, your experience, your advice. If folks kind of want to, obviously you're super busy, you're getting pitched all the time at Redpoint, but like if folks were, wanted to reach out to you, what's a good place where you're kind of discussing things with people? Is it Slack? Is it Twitter? Where are you kind of sharing your thoughts and experiences?
Yeah, the easiest way to get in touch with me these days is Twitter. My DMs are open. You can always get me that way. And then, Jason at Redpoint is my email address.
Awesome. Well, listen, again, thank you so much, folks. We're going to wrap it up there. I want to thank Jason so much for his time today. We want to thank everybody for listening, for continuing to tell a friend about the show and helping us to grow the community and giving us feedback, in all the different ways that you watch podcasts and listen to podcasts. With that, we're going to wrap it up, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.